So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Thupten Jinpa here to our class and to the Host Center of Buddhist Studies, where this talk will be later made available. Thupten Jinpa is co-founder and president of the Compassion Institute, the chair of Mind and Life Institute, founder of the Institute of Tibetan Classics, and an adjunct professor at the School of Religious Studies at McGill University. Professor Jinpa is also a former Tibetan monk who holds the Geshe Hlarangpa degrees, which is the highest degree in the Geshe educational system, the Gaelic educational system, monastic system, as well as a BA in philosophy and a PhD in religious studies, both from Cambridge University. Since 1985, he has been the principal English translator to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and has in this capacity traveled extensively with him. He has translated and edited numerous books by the Dalai Lama, including the New York Times bestsellers Ethics for the New Millennium and The Art of Happiness, as well as the Dalai Lama's book on his dialogue with science titled Universe in a Single Atom. Professor Jinpa has been perhaps even more prodigious in his own scholarship and publications. These include works in Tibetan, English translations of classical Tibetan texts, and other books such as Self, Reality, and Reason in Tibetan Philosophy, Dispelling the Darkness, A Jesuit's Quest for the Soul of Tibet, which was co-authored by Donald Lopez, and A Fearless Heart, How the Courage to Be Compassionate Can Transform Our Lives. Professor Jinpa's latest book is titled Tsongkhapa, A Buddha in the Land of Snows, which is a modern biography of one of Tibet's greatest masters. Professor Jinpa is also the main author of CCT, Compassion Cultivation Training, which is an 8-week formal program developed at Stanford University. And he has lectured extensively on Buddhism and science, the dialogue, and secular adaptations of mindfulness and compassion practices. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jinpa to our class. Silent claps all around. Zoom muted.
Yeah, I think he's frozen maybe.
Oh, maybe.
And Ana Lopez for inviting me between Buddhism and science. I would also like to thank Host Center for Buddhist Studies for hosting these series and making these available to the larger public as well. My internet may be once in a while not very stable. If the problem turns out to be too bad, I'll switch off the video, just leave the audio. It's one of the downsides of doing these virtual events. You never know how good the connections are. Thank you, James, for introducing me. And I'm particularly happy to, be part of this conversation to Stanford students. And I myself had some connection with the university. I actually worked for 5 years, not in anything to do with religious studies faculty, but on the other side of the campus in the Neuroscience Institute, connected with the medical school. I was one of the pioneering groups of people who were involved in establishing this research on compassion, which led to the formation of CCARE, Center for Compassion and Altruism Research in Education. And I actually was on the Stanford payroll for 5 years. Never really moved there because it's just too expensive. I commuted. So what I thought I would do is to actually leave quite a lot of space for question and answer towards the end, because since you have already been exposed to a fair bit of reading material around this topic, and me being a traditional Buddhist, a former monk, one could say an insider, as an anthropologist would call, of within the tradition itself, there might be questions that you could ask me, from the other aspect, from the Buddhist tradition's perspective. But at the beginning, I'll say a few words and sharing my thoughts on this very, very general topic of Buddhism and science dialogue. Now, clearly, this dialogue between Buddhism and science, which can be really seen as a kind of a cultural encounter, is one of the most interesting and important, ongoing cultural phenomenon of our time, starting sometime in the later part of 20th century, and now it's ongoing. Today, it has become quite normal, not unusual, quite normal for scientists, particularly in the cognitive science domain and clinical science, to be sitting down with a monk and chatting and actually having formal conferences where, members of the monastic community turning up in robes, are taken seriously as equal participants in conversations and dialogue. In some cases, these monastic members have in fact been co-designers of research protocols and co-authors on major scientific publications as well. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and it has become kind of quite normal to see, monastics and Buddhist scholars really at these events. Now, we also know from a kind of a larger cultural and societal phenomenon that there have been an opening to the ideas of, practices and insights that, although a lot of people may not be aware of their sources, but in fact can be traceable to Buddhism. So the obvious example is mindfulness. Today, mindfulness is a phenomenon that we see everywhere. It's almost to the point of being just too ubiquitous, mindful this, mindful that. If you type in Google and search for the word mindful, apparently in Amazon someone did that, and over 5,000-6,000 titles turn up. Titles of books turn up with a mindful as a part of the title. So clearly, this is massive. Similarly, we also see, application of mindfulness, not initially in the clinical and health domain, but increasingly in other sectors like workplace, leadership training, management studies, and so on and so forth. Similarly, we also see now increasingly in other types of contemplative practices like loving kindness meditation or compassion training, which I was involved in developing at Stanford. The CCT was developed at Stanford, under the auspices of the medical school. And now it's being applied clinically as well. So there are adaptations of CCT for dealing with burnout among physicians. There is in fact an adaptation of CCT being offered to the law enforcement region, state. So we also see increasingly people adopting compassion-based training in the leadership. So we see the phenomenon is quite widespread, and these are clearly products coming out of this exchange between Buddhism and science. Now, of course, one of the key figures in the promotion of this exchange has really been the Dalai Lama himself. His Holiness's interest in science goes really far, all the way back to his early childhood in Tibet. And initially, I think it began as a curiosity of a young, busy mind child in things mechanical, because there was hardly anything mechanical in Tibet when he was growing up. So he was fascinated by mechanical objects, including watches, and then pulled them down and put them together, and trying to understand the mechanisms behind these mechanical objects, which then of course he was trained in the classical Buddhist debate and philosophical education, which always adopts a very critical standpoint in relation to inquiry into knowledge. So the question why is a very important part of a monastic education. So then, of course, once you take interest in the mechanical objects and technology, then the question arises, what is the mindset that has produced these kind of objects, And then, of course, one could argue that technology is the application of science, and science is the worldview and the ideology underpinning the mechanical objects. So to cut a long story short, so his initial interest in science really began out of curiosity of a sort of, busy mind. And then in India, after coming to India, he had the opportunity to really sit down with scientists. So he had been at the forefront of promoting science. And I know that you have read his very lengthy essay, which was, featured as an introduction to this series, the first volume in the series, Science and Philosophies of the Indian Buddhists, from the Indian Buddhist classics. His very lengthy essay really kind of articulates, the thinking behind his advocacy of his science and Buddhism dialogue. Briefly put, His Holiness speaks about two major objectives as part of this, dialogue. One he sees as a kind of a more epistemological, in the sense that Buddhism has been very interested, for thousands of years in understanding the nature of the human mind and how it works, the mechanisms, as including developing trainings based on this. So, and that makes perfect sense because Buddhism being a non-theological religion, if we can call it religion, then the question of conception of its liberation or freedom or salvation really has to be defined in such a way it doesn't require, receiving grace from some external powerful source. So in some sense, the Buddha's dictum, you're your own master, you're your own savior. And for that very same reason, you are your own enemy. That is really the essence of Buddha's teaching. So that if there is a conception of salvation or liberation, I'm using the word very loosely, salvation in the sense of soteriology, then in Buddhism, because there is no goal, that conception of liberation and freedom has to involve some kind of perfection of the human mind. So therefore, understanding how the mind works and seeing mind as the source of both our suffering and also the potential door to liberation is why Buddhism has historically taken such a great interest in understanding the nature of the mind, in the training the mind. So His Holiness's first objective is to really say, look, science is just beginning to get into the territory of studying the mind. Up until recently, it has been very much focused on the material. But now it's getting involved in the study of consciousness, mind, mental, all the mental experiences. But Buddhism has been there for a long time. So joining forces and entering into dialogue may actually help contribute to this growing scientific body of knowledge with respect, particularly to the understanding the human mind, including emotions and so on. So that's a sort of a knowledge agenda, which is really saying, hey, look, if we join forces, we might actually make a joint contribution to this growing body of knowledge about the human mind. The second is a more practical objective. And here His Holiness says that one of the things about Buddhism and other Indian traditions is that there are a lot of, we can use the word loosely, technology of the mind, techniques for developing mind, dealing with the negative aspects of the human mind, such as strong emotions, how to regulate them, how to bring awareness into these situations, and also how to enhance and cultivate and promote the more positive aspects of the mind, such as compassion, loving kindness, resilience, and so on and so forth. So there are, quite extensive resources in the traditional Indian traditions in general, particularly in Buddhism. So again, his agenda is that maybe we can find something if scientists and Buddhist scholars and practitioners sit down, find ways to adapt and adopt and adapt and standardize more secular, universal applications of these. So of course, this second part has been criticized from within the Buddhist tradition, particularly for cultural appropriation, for decontextualization of these practices, for divorcing it from the ethical foundation and all of this, which are, all very legitimate criticism. But someone like His Holiness is very conscious and aware that it is being done for a very specific purpose, which is to really develop techniques and applications which can be more broadly shared, regardless of one's personal persuasions of religious inclination. And here, I think His Holiness is really taking to heart the Buddha's own statement when he says that I've taught only one thing, one and one thing only, the elevation of suffering. And His Holiness is really taking that statement from the Buddha very seriously to say there's nothing wrong in digging into the Buddhist resources, adopting them and adapting them, so long as we are very clear what we are doing. So yes, he will take into account the criticism from some of the traditional Buddhist side of decontextualization, cultural appropriations, and so on and so forth. But he would be arguing that there is a greater goal we can serve. So that's the second objective that he has presented. So clearly, now on the knowledge side, I think the jury is still out. Whether Buddhism can really truly enrich the resources of the scientific studies of mind and consciousness, and whether a really meaningful, in-depth joint project, collaborative project could be initiated that will enable, scholars and researchers to dig into the resources of Buddhism. There are quite a lot. For example, if you look at Abhidharma, the earliest Abhidharma text can be dated to the 1st or the 2nd century of the Common Era. And by then already, the sophistication of the taxonomy and the framework these great Buddhist masters have created is unprecedented. Until recent development in psychological sciences, there is nothing in the entire world that could rival the sophistication and depth and the breadth of these scholarship. If you look at the mental factors list, how each of these mental factors are defined, their natures identified, their functions listed, and their correlation, their relation, the behavioral measurable ways. So there is a huge resources in the Abhidharma. Similarly, if you look at the Dharmakirti and Dignaga's epistemology, the theory of knowledge, the concept of, the understanding of the formation of concepts, the relationship between thought and language, how, children acquire ability to use universal terms based on a particular experience, like by seeing an individual cow and calling it cow. How can the next time a child sees another cow, which is a completely different color in another place, and is able to recognize this is a cow? That kind of recognition based on extrapolation of universal features. These are, discussed and explained in great depth in the Buddhist epistemological text, starting from the 5th, 6th century onwards. And there's a huge discussion on the distinct modalities of direct experience like perceptions versus concept-based thoughts, which operate via medium of language and other things. So there is, and then the Vajrayana resources have extensive presentation on the relationship between subtle energies and states of consciousness. So the waking state, dreaming state, deep sleep state, and ultimately the death itself. So there is huge resources, but then whether, one of the interesting things is that many of the scientists who are participating in these dialogues generally are driven by their own scientific agenda. You have to write a paper, you have to find a specific research topic, you have to get an NIH grant. So they don't really have the luxury to take a big picture and come up with a strategy. So maybe something like Force Center could come up with a more strategic approach, because and this would require a collaboration between researchers, both from the cognitive and clinical scientific domain, and Buddhist studies humanities scholar who has in-depth appreciation of these resources. So the jury is still out, but on the second aspect, which is the practical applications, the story has been has panned out what His Holiness has envisioned has really panned out. On a, sum total, the benefits for the secular, contemporary culture has been a positive one through this encounter with Buddhism. Of course, there is the other side of the story, which is how is this encounter going to impact the traditional Buddhist culture itself and Buddhism as a historical religion? That is less clear. And, I would recommend reading a paper that I wrote quite a while ago about Tibetan Buddhism's engagement with science, starting all the way back to the late 1940s when Ginjin Chöpel wrote an essay. And then my paper was entitled Science as an Ally for a Rival Philosophy. So from the Buddhist tradition side, the encounter with science is something that is unavoidable because that is part of Tibetan, for example, the Buddhist cultures, societies like Tibetan coming into contact with modernity. No tradition can escape encounter with modernity. So an encounter with science is part of that larger, historical cultural experience. Now, how this encounter is going to impact the tradition itself depends very largely, and this is where His Holiness has been very insightful. His Holiness has really encouraged to take a proactive approach instead of being dragged into engaging with science. His advocacy has been to take a more proactive approach and use Buddhist tradition's own strength as a basis from which to engage with science. So and one of the of course, if you look at the history, I mean, having been trained myself in contemporary studies as well, I mean, I was at Cambridge. One of the powerful contributions from contemporary humanities approach is bringing historical perspective to any problems. And if in this encounter between Buddhism and science, one of my early thoughts was to look at historical precedents, and then of course we know the long history of engagement, encounter between Christianity and the Christian institutions, religious institutions, and science, and that hasn't been a smooth sailing. And so many of the cultural and philosophical issues that have come up in this long exchange, which parts of the story will get replayed in this encounter between Buddhism and science at this point is unclear. But one thing that is for sure is that if you look at the broader history of science and religion's encounter, generally science ended up taking a more hegemonic role, and religious institutions and religious worldviews gradually ceding the territories. So the domain of religious worldview has shrunk. And here Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria is this idea that somehow religion and science are operating in two completely distinct domains, and they don't overlap each other. And that's the way to also respect each other and keep each other's peace, which is interesting, but I don't think it really applies in the case of Buddhism. So now, I know that His Holiness is attributed with this very famous statement where he says that if there is something important in Buddhist thought, which science disproves, then the Buddhism will have to change and modify. And that is true. He's making a very powerful statement. But does that mean everything in Buddhism is up for grabs in this dialogue? Or are there any non-negotiables, from the standpoint of Buddhism? What about concept of rebirth? What about karma across lifetimes? What about conception of non-material consciousness? So, the Four Noble Truths. are they non-negotiables, or are we truly saying that everything in Buddhism is up for grabs in this dialogue, in this debate, in this encounter? Now, one strength that the Buddhist tradition does have is its own traditional hermeneutics and epistemological and logical tools. For example, in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, because of its long interest in Dharmakirti and epistemology, there are quite sophisticated epistemological, resources there. For example, the division of phenomena into three realms. One is the evident, domain that are susceptible to, perception, and then there are domains which require, inference, which are not so obvious and evident to our everyday senses, but based on what we experience, we can infer through causal relationships. And then there is the third domain, which really remains completely hidden and opaque to ordinary mind, unless individuals are able to really, heighten their states of mind, be able to have access. So there is this, and these three, domains of reality or dimensions of reality are correlated with three sources of knowledge. One is the perception, second is inference, and third is testimony, which includes scriptural citations. And in Buddhism, interestingly, unlike other traditions, the priority is completely upside down. Among the three sources of knowledge, the most important one and the most authoritative one is the experience, perception. Next comes inference, and then comes testimony, including the scriptures. And the scriptures are valid only, it is valid to invoke scriptures only in a very specific, exceptional circumstances. Otherwise, in most cases, one needs to rely on perception or inference based on perception. So there is that thing. Another thing that is important in the Buddhist tradition is this logical distinction that is made between not finding an evidence or not proving versus disproving. That is a very important distinction. Just because science has not been able to prove something does not mean it has proven its opposite. And there is a whole logical principle and epistemological principle that goes with that, which is based on Dharmakirti's criteria of inference. So these are important resources that are there in Buddhism. So from the Buddhist tradition, and one of the things that I have been involved in is really, a lot of the writings that you see in English on this dialogue is really from the perspective of contemporary, experience of secular engagement with Buddhism, which is really coming more from the Western experience. What I've been interested in and involved in is really looking at it from the other side, which is the traditional Buddhist perspective, and how might this encounter with science impact and inform and shape the Buddhist tradition, its ongoing historical development. So, and here it's different because, for example, even though you may be Buddhist, depending on whether you are a contemporary Buddhist, who have personally chosen to embrace Buddhism as your spiritual path versus a traditional Buddhist, because contemporary Buddhists, the starting point of their worldview is scientific worldview, and then they will incorporate elements of Buddhism that fits within that worldview to make sense. Whereas the traditional Buddhist is coming from another direction, where their primary worldview is really from the Buddhist worldview. And then they will engage with science, and then they will incorporate elements of science that is important to bring into this Buddhist worldview. So the two individuals may be Buddhists, but their engagement with science is completely different. So the story from the traditional Buddhist perspective is not really represented well in the literature right now, partly because the literature is all in English. Now in the Tibetan, in that 4-volume series on science and philosophies from the Buddhist tradition, Indian Buddhist classics, the first volume in the Tibetan volume, not the English one, carries a very, very long essay from me. And in this essay, I really try to bring the philosophy of science perspective and also really, make distinction between scientism, which is an ideology, versus science. Scientism is an ideology that believes that everything will be explainable in principle by science. Many scientists don't adopt that view. You can have philosophers of science who will have a more limited conception of what science is and the status of the scientific knowledge and claims. So I try to bring this debate in the Tibetan language so that the Tibetan scholars who are interested in science can engage with the debate in an informed way. Because otherwise what you have is, the essay that I wrote, I listed a couple of perspectives that the Tibetans ourselves bring. One is quite a naive perspective that, Buddhism is so great, science is finally catching up. So everything that Buddhism has been saying will be proven at some point. So that's a kind of a naive looking at science as an ally, which will really promote the Buddhist agenda. So that's one group. Another camp looks at science as a rival philosophy, saying that science is presenting a worldview. We ourselves have a worldview. Historically, Buddhist thinkers have engaged with non-Buddhist Hindu traditions, Brahminical traditions like the Vedantins and, Imams. Debate with science, and science is presenting a rival worldview, and Buddhism has to engage with science as we did with the Indian traditions in the past. Then there is the third position, which is a bit more nuanced, where there is an understanding that there are certain areas where science is much more advanced, like in the material world, physics, clearly chemistry, physics, astronomy, and so on and so forth, which Buddhists have been historically interested in. But because in the Indian context, in the Tibetan context, which is the Tibetans are inheritors of the Indian tradition, no technology was developed ever to help, sort of further the scientific enterprise. Although the initial scientific inquiry was there, but what made a huge difference in the West was the development of, all these great technology, starting from this massive, microscopes and all of these tools. The technology has really helped advance science in the West, because what it does is science is ultimately, from the Buddhist epistemological perspective, it's very empirical. So it's really based on the evidence of the perception. And what technology tools do is to help enhance our power of perception. So in some sense, you're really being able to see more than you could see with a naked human eye. But essentially, from an epistemological point of view, science primarily emphasizes the perceptual experience, perception part. So, so the third position is a bit more nuanced, and that's what someone like His Holiness would uphold. He would be operating from the Buddhist worldview, looking at science, incorporating aspects of science, scientific insights like in physics, biology, and so on and so forth, into the Buddhist worldview to make it complete. Yet the epistemology and the larger philosophical standpoint really will be Buddhist. And we look at science, and the scope of science is a more limited one. So it's more practical, conception of science. And that is, what I was also proposing in my long essay, but I presented various perspectives, so that the Buddhist scholars, and this kind of dialogue is going to happen because the major monastic universities have now incorporated science as a part of the monastic curriculum. So it is already there. So then this ongoing dialogue from the traditional side is an ongoing story, and it's too early to tell where this is going to lead. But the one fortunate thing is that the majority of the participants in this dialogue from the traditional side are now being exposed to science in a much more informed way. They're actually studying science. They're studying philosophy of science so that they can engage with science from that kind of perspective of broader historical understanding. And also the philosophical questions about, there is still a legitimate question as to what exactly is the status of scientific claims and knowledge. There is the Popper's falsifiability theory. You have the Hans Kuhn's kind of, paradigm shift idea. And then you have a much more radical anarchistic conception of Paul Feyerabend's idea that science is kind of like in anthropology, it's another story that we tell. And it has no privileged status with respect to knowledge claims. I find this particular conception a little too extreme, but he is making a point. So there are all, actually in the Western tradition itself, different conceptions of what science is. So that the Buddhist tradition's engagement with science and how far it can go will depend very largely on how well informed the participants in this dialogue are from the tradition's perspective, so that in the process, as the expression goes, we don't lose our soul in the process of translation. So I think I'll stop here and then we can have the Q&A. Thank you.